Jessica, a young nurse in her late 20s, was assigned to a new patient at Phoenix General Hospital in Arizona. Her patient, Mrs. Harris, had been in a coma for several months. Jessica felt a mix of excitement and anxiety as she stepped into her new role. This assignment was unlike any she had taken on before. Jessica's daily routine included feeding Mrs. Harris through a tube, monitoring her vital signs, and ensuring her comfort. The room, filled with the hum of medical machines, felt cold and sterile. However, Jessica noticed the personal touches that hinted at Mrs. Harris's life before the coma. Family photographs, a stack of books, and a handmade quilt draped over her legs. Determined to make a difference, Jessica talked to Mrs. Harris every day, sharing stories about her own life and reading aloud from the books on the bedside table. She hoped that somehow her words might reach Mrs. Harris. Despite the lack of response, Jessica found comfort in these moments. One afternoon, while adjusting Mrs. Harris's pillows, Jessica noticed a slight twitch in her fingers. Her heart raced with a mix of hope and confusion. She quickly dismissed it as a muscle spasm, common in coma patients, but the incident lingered in her mind. She decided to mention it to Dr. Parker, the physician overseeing Mrs. Harris's care. "Dr. Parker, I saw something today," Jessica said as she entered his office. Dr. Parker looked up from his desk, curiosity in his eyes. "What did you see, Jessica?" Mrs. Harris's fingers twitched while I was adjusting her pillows. "It was brief, but I thought you should know." Dr. Parker leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Muscle spasms are not unusual in coma patients," he explained. "But it's good that you're observant. I'll make a note and keep an eye on it." Jessica nodded, feeling a mix of reassurance and unease. Back in Mrs. Harris's room, she resumed her duties with renewed focus, watching closely for any further signs of movement. As the days turned into weeks, Jessica grew more attached to Mrs. Harris. One day, while tidying up the room, Jessica found a leather-bound journal tucked away in a drawer. Curiosity got the better of her, and she began to read. The journal entries painted a picture of a loving family and a life full of joy. Mrs. Harris wrote about her husband, David, their children, and the simple pleasures of daily life. But as Jessica read on, the tone of the entries changed. Mrs. Harris described feeling watched and increasingly uneasy. The final entries mentioned a car accident and her suspicions that it was not an accident at all. Jessica's mind raced with questions. Could Mrs. Harris's fears be real? She decided to share her discovery with David, hoping it might shed light on what had happened. That evening, when David arrived for his usual visit, Jessica approached him gently. "Mr. Harris, I found something I think you should see," she said, holding out the journal. David took the journal, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. As he read through the entries, his face grew pale. "I remember her talking about these fears," he said quietly. "I thought she was just stressed. I never imagined." Jessica placed a comforting hand on his arm. "I think we need to look into this more. There might be something we're missing." David nodded, his determination evident. "You're right. We need to find out what really happened." Together, they approached Dr. Parker with their concerns. Dr. Parker listened intently as Jessica and David recounted the journal's contents and their growing suspicions. He agreed to review Mrs. Harris's medical records for any irregularities. The following days were tense as they waited for Dr. Parker's findings. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something significant. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but many questions remained unanswered. What had truly happened to Mrs. Harris? And who, if anyone, was responsible? Jessica's unease grew, but so did her resolve to uncover the truth. She was determined to help Mrs. Harris, no matter what it took. The journey was only beginning, and the path ahead was shrouded in mystery. Jessica's unease lingered as she continued to care for Mrs. Harris. Every day, she hoped for a sign, any sign, that her patient might wake up. The journal entries haunted her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mrs. Harris's condition than met the eye. Dr. Parker had promised to look into Mrs. Harris's medical records, and Jessica anxiously awaited his findings. In the meantime, She kept a close watch on her patient, noting any subtle changes in her condition. The room, once cold and clinical, began to feel more like a sanctuary, a place where Jessica poured her heart into her work. One evening, David arrived for his usual visit, looking more weary than usual. He greeted Jessica with a tired smile and took his place by his wife's side. Jessica decided to share more of her thoughts with him. "Mr. Harris, I've been thinking a lot about what we found in the journal," Jessica began cautiously. "I can't help but feel that something isn't right. Have you noticed anything unusual before the accident?" David sighed, rubbing his temples. Claire was always so vibrant and full of life, but in the weeks leading up to the accident, she became more withdrawn, more anxious. She mentioned feeling watched, but I thought it was just stress. I never imagined it could be something more sinister. Jessica nodded, her resolve strengthening. "We need to dig deeper. I think there's more to uncover here." As the days passed, Jessica and David worked together, trying to piece together the puzzle. Jessica spent her free time researching coma patients and reading through Mrs. Harris's medical records. She found inconsistencies that suggested possible tampering, further fueling her suspicions. One afternoon, as Jessica was organizing Mrs. Harris's belongings, she found a stack of letters tucked away in a drawer. The letters were addressed to Mrs. Harris from various people, including friends and family. Jessica carefully read through them, looking for any clues. One letter stood out. It was from a friend who mentioned a heated argument she had witnessed between Mrs. Harris and someone named Dr. Benson. The friend expressed concern for Mrs. Harris's safety and suggested she be careful. Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She needed to know more about this Dr. Benson. She decided to bring it up with Dr. Parker during their next meeting. "Dr. Parker, I found something else that might be important," Jessica said, handing him the letter. "It mentions a Dr. Benson and an argument he had with Mrs. Harris." The friend was worried about her safety. Dr. Parker read the letter, his expression growing more serious with each word. "Dr. Benson is a colleague of mine. He's been involved in Mrs. Harris's treatment from the beginning. This is troubling." Jessica's mind raced. "Do you think he could have had anything to do with her condition?" Dr. Parker hesitated. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but we need to investigate this further. I'll review his involvement in her treatment and see if there are any irregularities." With Dr. Parker's support, Jessica and David continued their investigation. They reached out to a private investigator, hoping to uncover more about Dr. Benson and his possible motives. The investigator agreed to look into Mrs. Harris's financial records and any connections Dr. Benson might have. Days turned into weeks and the tension grew. Jessica's unease was mirrored by David's determination to find the truth. They met regularly with the private investigator, who slowly began to piece together a troubling picture. "Jessica, I found something," the investigator said during one of their meetings. "There are large payments from Mrs. Harris's accounts to an unknown recipient. It looks like these payments were made to a shell company, which is linked to Dr. Benson." Jessica felt a surge of anger and fear. "So, he's been receiving money from her accounts? Why?" The investigator shrugged. "It's hard to say for sure, but it looks like he might have been tampering with her medication to keep her in a coma, ensuring the payments continued." The revelation hit Jessica hard. She shared the findings with David, who was equally shocked. "We need to confront him," David said, his voice filled with determination. "He can't get away with this." Jessica agreed, but they knew they needed solid evidence to bring Dr. Benson to justice. They decided to gather more proof before making their move, knowing that any misstep could jeopardize their case. As the weeks passed, the sense of urgency grew. Jessica continued her care for Mrs. Harris, watching for any signs of improvement. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and the stakes were higher than ever. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the full picture was still out of reach. Jessica's resolve to uncover the truth and help Mrs. Harris recover only grew stronger, knowing that the journey was far from over. Jessica's determination intensified with each passing day. The findings about Dr. Benson were deeply troubling, and she knew they needed concrete evidence to take action. She continued her meticulous care of Mrs. Harris, hoping for any sign of improvement, while the investigation into Dr. Benson's activities pressed on. David, equally determined, spent hours digging through financial records and contacting friends and colleagues who might have more information. The private investigators' discoveries about the large payments to a shell company linked to Dr. Benson fueled their urgency. One evening, as Jessica was reading aloud to Mrs. Harris, David entered the room, looking more resolute than ever. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said quietly, motioning for her to step outside. They moved to a quiet corner of the hospital hallway. "I found more inconsistencies in the financial records," David began. "There are several unexplained transactions amounting to $50,000. It seems Dr. Benson was siphoning money from Claire's accounts over time." Jessica's eyes widened. "So he was not only tampering with her medications but also stealing from her?" David nodded. "It appears so. I've shared this with the investigator, and we're compiling everything. We need to confront Dr. Benson soon." Jessica felt a mix of anger and determination. "We need to be careful. If he realizes we're onto him, he might try to cover his tracks. We need undeniable proof." The next day, they met with the private investigator again. "We have enough to confront him," the investigator said, "but we need to ensure he doesn't escape or destroy evidence. I suggest we involve the authorities now." David agreed. "Let's do it. Claire deserves justice." With the plan in motion, Jessica, David, and the investigator gathered all their evidence. They presented their findings to the hospital administration and the police, detailing Dr. Benson's actions and their impact on Mrs. Harris's condition. The police agreed to set up a meeting with Dr. Benson under the pretense of a routine review of Mrs. Harris's case. Jessica and David, along with the investigator, were present, ready to confront him. As they waited in the conference room, Jessica's heart pounded with anticipation. The door opened, and Dr. Benson walked in, looking confident and unaware of the trap laid for him. "Dr. Benson, we need to discuss Mrs. Harris's case," Dr. Parker began, his tone neutral but firm. "There have been some disturbing findings regarding her treatment and financial matters." Dr. Benson's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. "What are you talking about?" The private investigator stepped forward. "We have evidence that you've been receiving large payments from Mrs. Harris's accounts and tampering with her medication to keep her in a coma." Dr. Benson's face turned pale. "This is absurd. You have no proof." "We have more than enough proof," Dr. Parker said, placing the documents on the table. "The police are already involved." Realizing he was cornered, Dr. Benson's facade began to crack. "You don't understand," he stammered. "I did what I had to do. Claire was going to ruin everything." David stood up, his voice shaking with controlled anger. "You tried to kill my wife for money. You won't get away with this." Dr. Benson, now desperate, tried to defend himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. The police officers in the room stepped forward to arrest him. "Dr. Benson, you are under arrest for attempted murder and fraud." As Dr. Benson was led away in handcuffs, Jessica felt a surge of relief. They had done it. They had exposed the truth. Back in Mrs. Harris's room, the atmosphere was lighter, filled with a sense of hope and justice. Jessica continued her vigilant care, watching closely for any signs of recovery. With Dr. Benson's arrest, they hoped Mrs. Harris might begin to improve without the malicious interference. Days turned into weeks, and gradually, Mrs. Harris began to show more signs of life. Small movements, changes in her breathing, and even the occasional flutter of her eyelids filled Jessica and David with cautious optimism. One evening, as Jessica sat by Mrs. Harris's bedside, reading from her favorite book, she noticed a slight pressure on her hand. She looked down and saw Mrs. Harris's fingers move, curling slightly around hers. Jessica's heart raced. "Mr. Harris?" she called softly to David, who was sitting on the other side of the bed. "Look, she's responding." David leaned forward, his eyes wide with hope. "Claire, if you can hear us, please give us another sign." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mrs. Harris's eyelids fluttered open. She looked around, her eyes focusing on David. David? She whispered, her voice weak but clear. David's eyes filled with tears. I'm here, Claire. I'm here. Jessica stepped back, tears of joy streaming down her face. They had not only uncovered the truth, but had also sparked the beginning of Mrs. Harris's recovery. The atmosphere in Mrs. Harris's room was filled with cautious optimism following her initial response. Jessica and David were overjoyed, but they knew the journey to full recovery would be long and challenging. Mrs. Harris's slow but steady improvement filled them with hope. Dr. Parker adjusted Mrs. Harris's treatment plan to support her gradual awakening. Jessica continued her dedicated care, spending long hours by Mrs. Harris's bedside, talking to her and reading aloud. David was a constant presence as well, sharing memories and encouraging his wife to keep fighting. One afternoon, as Jessica was adjusting Mrs. Harris's medication, she felt a familiar twitch on her hand. Mrs. Harris's fingers moved again, this time with more strength. Jessica smiled, her heart filled with joy. Mrs. Harris, can you hear me? Jessica asked gently. Mrs. Harris's eyes fluttered open, and she nodded weakly. Yes, she whispered. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. You're doing great. Just keep going. We're all here for you. David entered the room, his face lighting up when he saw his wife awake. Claire, it's so good to see you, he said, taking her hand. David, Mrs. Harris whispered, her voice gaining strength. What happened? David glanced at Jessica, who nodded for him to proceed. Claire, you were in a coma for several months. We discovered that Dr. Benson was responsible for your condition. He was tampering with your medication and stealing money from your accounts. Mrs. Harris's eyes widened. Dr. Benson? But why? David squeezed her hand. He's been arrested. We're working with the police and the hospital to ensure justice is served. The important thing is that you're awake now and on the road to recovery. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Harris continued to make progress. She regained more strength and began physical therapy to help her body recover from the long period of inactivity. Jessica and David were with her every step of the way, offering encouragement and support. The hospital staff was in awe of Mrs. Harris's remarkable recovery. Jessica's dedication was praised by everyone, and her bond with Mrs. Harris and David grew stronger. They became more than just patient, nurse, and family. They became close friends united by their shared journey. One day, Dr. Parker called a meeting with Jessica, David, and Mrs. Harris to discuss the final steps in their journey towards justice. We've gathered all the necessary evidence against Dr. Benson, Dr. Parker explained. The case is strong, and he will face trial soon. Mrs. Harris nodded, her resolve firm. I want to be there. I want to see justice served. Jessica and David exchanged a glance, both admiring Mrs. Harris's strength. We'll be with you, Jessica said, every step of the way. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Jessica, David, and Mrs. Harris sat together, facing Dr. Benson, who looked pale and defeated. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming, detailing the financial fraud and the malicious tampering with Mrs. Harris's medication. As the trial progressed, Jessica felt a sense of closure. They had fought hard to uncover the truth and bring Dr. Benson to justice. When the verdict was finally read, declaring Dr. Benson guilty on all charges, the room erupted in relief and satisfaction. After the trial, Mrs. Harris continued her recovery at home, with Jessica visiting regularly to provide care and support. The bond between them had grown into a deep friendship, and they often spent time together, reflecting on the journey they had been through. One sunny afternoon, Jessica sat in the garden with Mrs. Harris and David, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the beauty of the flowers. We've been through so much, Mrs. Harris said, her voice filled with gratitude. But it's made us stronger. I never thought I'd be here, surrounded by the people I love most. Jessica smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. We've come a long way, and we have a bright future ahead of us. David nodded, his eyes shining with happiness. Thank you, Jessica, for everything you've done. You've given us hope and a new beginning. As they sat together, enjoying the moment, Jessica knew that their journey had transformed them all. They had faced their darkest moments and emerged victorious, united by hope, resilience, and the uncovering of hidden truths. Their story was a testament to the power of love and determination, and they were ready to embrace whatever the future held.